I'm Peter Henderson, and this is the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast.
The founder of Celtic Boys Club has been found guilty of sexual offences against 3 boys in the 1980s and 1990s.
What the case comes down to is whether or not Celtic Football Club are responsible in law for the terrible acts of the paedophiles at the heart of Celtic Boys Club.
One by one, he raped them. He raped them systematically.
A child has got no chance of getting away from the child abuser. The fear and the terror is off the scale.
We were all young boys, 14, 15, so nobody was going to really say anything because would they have been believed?
Just a warning, this podcast will not be gratuitous, but it will discuss the sexual abuse of children and its consequences. The biggest thing you can do to support the podcast is to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. The more members of the public that know about this podcast means the more people getting the survivor's message out there. The podcast is free, but it does take a lot of time and effort to make. If you're able to make a small donation to its production, it goes a long way to help. Please follow the link to our Patreon donation site. It's your help that makes this podcast possible. Hello and welcome to the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast, episode 3. I'm standing at Queen's Cross on Maryhill Road in Glasgow. Before the motorway system was built in the city, this road was one of the main arterial routes into the centre from the northwest of Glasgow. The people who live here now will not know this, but not far from here, in the winter of 1966, a 19-year-old paedophile called Jim Torbett put in motion a plan which would see him become one of British football's most notorious and prolific child sex abusers. In a local community hall, he'd arranged to meet the Glasgow Celtic manager Jock Stein and the club's chairman Sir Robert Kelly. Now, as amazing as it may seem today, these two illustrious figures of British sport had agreed to meet the young man. Torbett's plan was to set up a youth football team and for it to be associated with Celtic. Despite Torbett not having any previous connection to football or any experience as a coach, Stein and Kelly agreed. And so Celtic Boys Club was born. They would play in Celtic strips, train at Celtic Stadium and their training ground, and appear almost every week in Celtic's official newspaper. The Boys Club would produce some of British football's most famous stars, and with this pipeline of talent, it would cement Celtic's place as one of the powerhouses of European football. But the Boys Club would also become synonymous with rampant child abuse, with widespread links to other paedophiles in youth football throughout Scotland and further afield. This gang of child sex abusers would oversee a reign of terror which operated in plain sight until the 1990s. But this location has other dark links to the early days of the Celtic Boys Club paedophile ring. A local toy shop once operated just yards from where I'm standing. It belonged to Joseph Boyle, a Boys Club official and friend of Jim Torbett. This shop was the location for some of the first known assaults on children. The survivor we're going to speak to in this episode has waived his anonymity, and he knows to his cost just what went on in this toy shop and what it was like to be one of Jim Torbett's earliest victims. We're going to hear from Gordon Woods. This is the first part of his story.
Celtic had just won the European Cup. It was a tremendous opportunity for any young kid who had an interest in football to be a part of that. And that was why I went for the trials. Sadly, I'd never been, in the eyes of many coaches, very good at football, because a lot of the schoolboy teams, the school team, boys brigade team, that kind of thing, I was what was commonly known as a sub-player. I was never picked for the first team, but occasionally I came on as a sub. And that was how good I was. So when I went for the trial, I genuinely didn't have very high expectations.
So what happened when you arrived for your first trial at Celtic Boys Club?
We met up just outside the building, just outside Celtic Park. We got changed and we ran up London Road to Barrowfield, which again is the Celtic training ground. And the trials were held at Barrowfield. At the end of the trial, when we were back down from London Road and we were getting changed, one of the officials that were there at the time, there was 3 or 4 adults in the Celtic jackets and ties and everything. And one of these individuals came up to the group of boys who'd been on trial. And there was no great emotional respect for the children in doing this, but he would just look at one boy and say, "You've been selected, you've been unsuccessful, you've been unsuccessful, you've been unsuccessful." And he went down the line and he got to me and he pointed to me and said, "You've been unsuccessful." And that was that. I respected that and had, as I said earlier, had probably expected it. But shortly afterwards, I was approached by one of the coaches or one of the officials who told me to ignore that and to come back for training the following week. That official was James Torbett.
So this was the first time you'd met Jim Torbett. What did you make of him?
Do you know, it's easy to say this in hindsight, Peter, but I can recall when he told me to come back for training the following week. He put his hand on my shoulder and said to me, "Come back, just ignore that, Gordon." I think he actually said, "I'd like to see you come back to training next week." And he then squeezed my shoulder and let me go. Now, at the time, I felt nothing about that, but I can remember feeling uncomfortable. And that was within seconds of meeting the guy. And I felt uncomfortable, but had no reasons for feeling uncomfortable, really. And it's easy to now look back on these things in hindsight, but that's what you do. And it certainly made me feel, even at that stage, there was something not right. But I mean, he was a big guy. He was quite tall. He was well built. I was a very small 13-year-old. So to me, he was quite daunting when you spoke to him.
Was Torbett actually involved in the trial in a coaching sense, or was he more the man in overall charge?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, he. I think some of the other coaches at the trial actually had tracksuits on. They changed into tracksuits. But Torbett didn't. Torbett kept on his tie, his shirt and tie, and his jacket and the Celtic uniform, shall we say, throughout the trial. He certainly didn't get involved in the trial in any way at all, as far as kicking a ball or anything. He was watching what was happening. And this is what, possibly looking back on it, where the person who was responsible for the skill element of the children had rejected my application. But Torbett, who wasn't seen to be involved in the skill factors of the trialists, invited me to come back.
So what happened then?
I think it was the following Thursday. I went back to the training, and I think it was either that Thursday or the following Thursday where Jim Torbett presented me with a bag. It was a Celtic Boys Club bag, and inside the bag there was my Celtic Boys Club blazer, a shirt, a tie, and grey slacks. And it was the uniform of Celtic Boys Club.
How did it make you feel to get all this new kit?
Oh, just unbelievable. I mean, it was, I wouldn't say it was a dream come true because it was something I hadn't dreamt of. But certainly to have that in your possession as a 13-year-old boy pertaining to a club that at that time were European champions. You know, a 13-year-old boy just couldn't put that into words, how he felt.
When did things with Torbett start to go wrong? How did the abuse begin?
The young lad who I had been training, known, who'd invited me to the club, Jim Torbett used to drive him and I home. And for some reason, within a month or two, the other young lad used to start getting the bus home, and Torbett would just drive me home in the evenings after training. And Jim Torbett used to stop the car 50 yards, 100 yards from the house in amongst this area where it was just trees. The purpose of, or his reasons for stopping was he wanted to discuss with me what had happened at the trial and to discuss some of the problems I was having at home, because I was really quite unhappy at home at that point in time. And I was very emotional, very vulnerable with certain issues. And Torbett used to stop and discuss those with me, to ask me how I was doing and how I was doing at school and what have you. And it was on one of those occasions where he abused me for the first time.
What was going through your mind when this happened?
I was terrified, to be honest, Peter, because this was all shortly after the Moors murders. And, you know, people forget the boys that were abused in the 60s. That was common knowledge at that time about the Moors murderers. And it was all about children being abused and being abducted and murdered. And, you know, there's so many things that through a 13-year-old's mind. But for the actual abuse, it was, I just froze. I couldn't move. And strangely enough, where my house was, across the road from my house, there was a street lamp. And my father used to always park under that street lamp. And I remember the first time I just stared at that street lamp. And I didn't take my gaze off it. I just stared at the street lamp. And I was praying that my father would come out to his car. But sadly, over the months that followed, my father never ever did come out to that car. But that's how I coped with that scenario. I would just stare at the street lamp.
Did Torbett say anything to you during or after the abuse?
Well, I'll tell you what happened the very first time I was abused, Peter. When I went to leave the car, Jim Torbett grabbed a hold of my leg. It was my right leg as I was leaving the car. And I turned to look at him and he said to me, "Don't worry, Gordon, I won't tell your mum and dad what you've done." And he said, "Because your mum and dad would stop you coming for the boys' club if they knew. And you don't want to leave your friends at the club." Now, at that time, all that did was instill in a 13-year-old boy that it was me that had done something wrong. And not only did he make me feel the guilt, the shame and the embarrassment on that occasion, he also on that occasion made it very clear to me what the consequences would be if I opened my mouth. Now, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing which Torbett said. This was planned. This was something that I think was a part of their weaponry to ensure the silence of children.
How did the abuse and your involvement with Celtic Boys Club progress?
The thing just continued, and it was the training continued, and it got to a point where the abuse was expected, and you knew that if you were getting taken home by Torbett, that he would ensure that all the other lads were dropped off before me, and I was the last to get dropped off. And I knew when I was sitting in that car what was about to happen. At 13 years of age, you don't think that this is, you know it's wrong, you know it's bad, you know it's evil, but you don't have a way out, because if I spoke to my parents about it, and you know, there's another thing, Peter, you try to, I was to a point, even at that young age, I was trying to protect my mother and father from knowing what had happened to me.
As part of the abuse, and this applies to Torbett more than other members of the Celtic Boys Club paedophile ring, he showered his victims with attentions and gifts, didn't he?
Oh, it was, you were made to feel like a king, you know, you were taken out for meals. After training, we would go to a restaurant in Sucky Hall Street, and we'd have a meal at night. Now, again, at that point in my life, my parents weren't wealthy people. And I can't remember ever going to a restaurant with my parents. But here was me being taken to a restaurant and sitting down and having a nice meal with Jim Torbett. And it wasn't it was a nice, expensive restaurant. It was a nice Italian restaurant. And this was the way you were treated. You were treated with gifts. I get new football boots regularly. If I knew a new Adidas football boot came out, Torbett always had the football boots for me. And of course, the uniform was always there.
How else did he manipulate and scheme to prey on you and other boys?
He told me to tell my parents that we were going on an away game, which would involve an overnight stay. And I actually believed that. And when I turned up at the meeting point with my Celtic uniform on and all my kit in my bag and my football boots and my Celtic Boys Club strip, it transpired there was no away game. And instead, Torbett took myself and another lad to his flat in Pinkston Drive, where he asked us to work on making these little plastic medals. And as that night progressed, we stayed at Torbett's flat. And during the night, I woke to Torbett having joined myself and another lad in bed. And he had put his legs in a position where I couldn't move. And I was abused. I remember that night, some part of it, I can't remember when, but I remember at some point in the evening or during the night, I got up and I sat in the lounge and I was shaking because I remember thinking there was another young lad in that room and I was fearful for him because I thought, I'm out here now, but is he abusing the other young boy? But sadly, I couldn't build up the courage to go and say anything or do anything. I just sat there till morning. And Torbett got up in the morning, came through, and all he said to him was, "Do you want some scrambled egg?" That was it, nothing else.
We're going to take a break just for a moment. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back. Remember to help the podcast if you can subscribe. That lets you know when new episodes come out. And if you're able to make a small donation to this free podcast, it goes a long way to help. Now, let's get back to Gordon's story. Did your mum and dad raise any concerns at this point?
Because it was Celtic Football Club. If it had been a junior club, but this was instructions that was coming from a coach, and my mother, my father didn't see any difference between the Celtic Boys Club and Celtic Football Club. They saw it as being the same, and when the Celtic Boys Club were inviting young lads for overnight stays, they saw that as the European champions, and they had no reason to distrust anything that was happening at that time. Absolutely none.
I'm going to ask you about an incident in the toy shop in Maryhill Road, Joe's Toy Shop, which was operated by Joseph Boyle, Celtic Boys Club official and friend of Torbett's. And I want to warn the listeners that I know your account of Torbett's behaviour is upsetting.
We'd been to the toy shop once or twice before, and on this particular occasion we went to the toy shop, and this is what I say when Celtic had just won the European Cup, because in the toy shop on this occasion they had boxes and boxes of replicas of a European Cup, a little thing 3 or 4 inches high, and they were replicas of the European Cup, and it stood on a little plastic black base. And what Torbett asked me to do was, with a dymo gun, which put letters onto strips of plastic, with his dymo gun I was to type in Celtic FC winners 1967, and I was to stick this plastic onto the plastic plinth that the little trophy stood on, little plastic trophy. And there was literally thousands and thousands of these trophies. And I was asked to stand in the shop and do this, which I started doing, and Jim Torbett and the other individuals in the shop. I do remember him quite clearly. And at some point, Torbett asked me to go into the back of the shop to get another box of the little cups. Now, when I went into the back shop, the cups were all stored on there was a dozen boxes or so, and they were on a table in the middle of the room. And I went to pick one up, and Torbett had followed me in. And I noticed from the side of my eye that he turned and he'd sat on the edge of the table. And at that point, with his left hand, he put his left hand out and took the back of my neck and pushed my neck down, my head down. I can recall where I pursed my teeth, I gritted my teeth and I pursed my lips, and I just wasn't allowing it to happen. And he kept the pressure on the back of my neck for some time, and when he had concluded the sexual act on himself, he let me go. And I turned and I walked out the shop. I was absolutely terrified, and I had no money at that point. I was 7 or 8 miles, maybe more, from home, and all I wanted to do was get home, but I couldn't go home by the quickest route because I was frightened that Torbett was going to follow me. So I took a different route home. No, he didn't. And what I was annoyed about at the time was because when I can remember going out the shop and I was actually crying, but the other gentleman in the shop didn't do anything. He didn't say, wait a minute, what's wrong? Nothing. In fact, as I was walking up Garstube Road towards Bearsden Cross, because I took a long way home to get back so Torbett couldn't follow me. A woman stopped me in the street and asked me if I was okay. And I remember I sat down, it was on a wall, a stone wall, and I sat down and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." She says, "You want me to phone your mum?" And I said, "No, I'm not far from home, I'm just going to go home." And I left. And when I eventually did get home, I remember going by the kitchen door and straight up to my room, and I lay there for the rest of the night. And the strange thing is, Peter, that my mother must have known something had happened, because I can remember late that night my mother coming into my bedroom. She didn't say anything to me. All she did was she lifted my head slightly, took away my pillow, and gave me another pillow. And it was because the pillow she took away was soaking wet. And why my mother never asked me, I don't know, and I'll never know. But I can recall that pillow being changed because my pillow was soaking with tears. And that was what that individual did to a 13-year-old boy.
How did things end between you, Torbett, and Celtic Boys Club?
The abuse in the toy shop was the last severe abuse that I suffered. And I've only got my own thoughts on this, Peter, but because I think it was the following week, Jim Torbett had driven me home on the Thursday night. And this was a week after, maybe 10 days after the toy shop incident. And I can remember as he turned the bend in Kinfons Drive to the long sort of stretch up to my house, my father was in the garden. So Torbett took me right to the door. And my dad came out and said to Jim Torbett, come in for a coffee. And I can remember Jim looking at me and saying, yeah, okay. And we were in for a coffee. And my father, as we were coming in the door, my father got a hold of my shoulder and says, go up to your room, Gordon. So I went up to my room. And a few minutes later, I heard shouting downstairs. And I came down the stairs and Torbett had left. And I think it was the following Thursday or the Thursday after that when Torbett called me to his car after training, which I thought he was taking me home. And he had another young lad sitting in the front of his car, the passenger seat where I always sat in the front of his car. So on this occasion, I had to jump in the back. And Jim Torbett turned to me and said, our friendship's over. I don't think you should come back to the boys' club anymore. And he asked, I was just absolutely distraught. Very upset, and there was just so many things went through my mind. And the saddest part of it all was, by this time I was 14 years of age, just turned 14 probably. I had to get out of that car and arrange to get a bus home myself. And I can recall the whole bus journey because I had to take 2 buses and a subway to get home. It wasn't a pleasant journey, and I was just absolutely distraught. And there was no words for it at that time. I just couldn't come to terms with what had happened. But from what I can gather from things that transpired over the years, I think when Torbett grabbed my neck in the toy shop, he'd bruised the back of my neck. And I think my parents had seen that. And my father had gone into my room and he'd done a bit of searching in my room and he found a letter that I had written to Jim Torbett asking Jim Torbett to stop hurting me. Obviously, I hadn't sent the letter because it was still in my room, but my father had found it. And my father sent that letter with a covering letter from himself to Jock Stein at Celtic Park. And I think it was the following week when Jim Torbett told me not to come back to the club.
We have approached Celtic Football Club to ask them for a comment. We've received no reply. So that's the first part of Gordon's story. In a future episode, he'll explain how his long fight for justice and his fight to be believed saw him face down Jim Torbett in court. We'll have a preview of episode 4 in just a moment, but if you can remember to follow the podcast, it really helps us continue with the work. The podcast is of course free, but if you're able to make a small donation via our Patreon site, the link is in the show notes, it really helps to cover the cost involved in making the series. Now, coming up in episode 4.
I explained the pain they'd gone through, and I said, look, they've told me in graphic detail what you did to them. What have you got to say to these guys? What have you got to say to these guys whose lives you ruined? what have you got to say? I put it to him that he knew other paedophiles. I put it to him that he worked with McCafferty and Bennell